This summer I learned to fish with grandfather at the bend in the old river. The day started with a stubborn heat that hung in the air like a damp shawl, and the water wore a glassy smile, as if it knew a secret the land did not hurry to tell. The willows along the bank whispered with every breath of the current, their leaves shivering like old men remembering better days. Grandfather came from the little shack in a cloud of dust, the rope of his suspenders creaking, his hat brim scratched from years of sun and crooks of wire, and he carried the battered tin box of gear that smelled faintly of oil and fish scales. He wore that look of his, half a confession, half a promise, that told me the world would always offer something, if you kept your hand steady and your heart open. We settled on a gravel shelf where the bend of the river slowed its pulse, and the water mirrored the sky with a patient, almost polite calm. He showed me the rod first, its paint chipped by time, the line that tangled with every breeze, and the little wooden bobber that seemed to bounce even when the wind did nothing. He tied a knot with careful fingers and spoke in that soft, even voice he used with old tools and old stories. In fishing, as in life, you wait for the water to come to you. You don't rush the river. You learn to listen to it. The air smelled of warm clay, damp grass, and something sweeter I couldn't quite name. Smoked cherries from the thermos, perhaps, or the faint scent of river plants when you crush them between your fingers. The sun pressed down in gentle exhalations, making the river look almost holy, a bright hymn of blue that reflected the clouds as if they were floating prayers. I held the rod with both hands as if it spoke for me, and grandfather watched for a moment longer than I liked, as if gauging whether I had come to this moment ready to bear something heavier than a child's eagerness. "Now," he said, and his voice rose just a touch, as if he were about to tell me a secret that could not belong to anyone else. "Watch the line. Watch the water. The fish will tell you when to move, and not a second sooner." He did not rush the lesson with words, but with a quiet demonstration, the tilt of his wrist, the loosening of the drag, the way he breathed out as the line stretched taut and then sank a little, like something sighing underwater. We waited, and if there was any drama in the moment, it came from the chorus of the day itself, the cicadas that wrote their arias on the heat, the distant clink of a bucket, a bird calling from the far bank, the soft scuff of my shoes through the gravel that seemed to surface and disappear beneath the water's edge. For a long stretch, I felt the world shrink to a single breath between me and the river, and I found, to my own surprise, that waiting did not ache. It steadied something inside me that had learned too quickly to rush and shout and pretend courage where there was none. Grandfather did not fill the silence with words. He let the river do most of the talking. When the bobber gave a timid tremble, a small tremor that you would miss if you blinked, he tapped the rod with his finger and whispered, "Here comes the conversation." And then, with a patient, almost tender patience, I felt the line pull and the fish's resistance meet the line's reply, a delicate back and forth that ended with the fish's small body curling in the current, a stubborn silver arc that the water could not forget. I would like to tell you I felt triumphant in that moment, that the world suddenly widened and made room for me to finally stand tall. But what I felt was more like a soft wind slipping under a door I hadn't realized was ajar. A kind of recognition arrived, quiet and nearly shy. I understood that this creature, this living thing with a life of its own, had chosen to trust the river as I was choosing to trust grandfather. The act of catching a fish on that bend was not a conquest, but a quiet accord, a promise to be careful, to be gentle, to listen with more than ears. Grandfather returned the fish to the water after a careful measurement and a nod, as if the act itself preserved what needed preserving. He spoke then, not as a lecturer, but as someone who had learned the river in his bones. Some days you catch a fish, and some days you learn what kind of fisherman you are. Today, you've learned to listen. He smiled in a way that made the heat dip a little, as if the sun, too, remembered older, cooler days. We shared a moment of contented stillness after that, the line still quivering softly, the water widening like a small sigh, the world shrinking again to the simple certainty that the river had given us something we could carry away, even if just in memory. We talked little after that. He told a story about a rain-soaked harvest when the river rose and the people on the bank learned to wait, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. And I listened, absorbing not just the words, but the cadence of his voice, the pause between sentences that held weight and carry, the way his chest rose and fell, with the steady rhythm of a man who had learned to pace himself through years of work and worry. When the heat finally loosened its grip and the afternoon drifted toward the edge of evening, we began to pack away. The line came down with a sigh, the tin box shut with a soft thud, and the river took back its own, leaving behind a slim, sun-warmed silence. On the walk back to the shack, I carried more than a memory. I carried a kind of map. Grandfather's hands, not tying and patient, became my blueprint for living. To hold steady, to wait, to trust that even when the water is shallow or the night is long, there is a way forward if you listen and keep your heart soft. That memory, like a seal pressed into wax, remained with me as I grew older. In the years that followed, I learned other things. How to mend a sleeve, how to hold a child while they cried, how to tell the difference between fear and caution. But the river taught the same lesson in different clothes. The world would rush at you with its bright demands, its loud promises, its sudden storms. And I found myself returning, again and again, to the patient pause of that bend, to the rhythm of grandfather's quiet certainty. I learned to read people the way I learned to read water, by listening to what was not said as much as to what was said, by noticing the small shifts in tone, the unspoken agreement that the best we can offer another is a steady presence. If I ever became someone who could calm a frightened child or soothe a tired patient, that came from the first lesson by the bend. To stay, to breathe, to wait for the moment that answers itself. Now, in the slow days of old age, when the world seems loud in my ears and the days stretch long and thin, I still hear the river's sigh in my memory. The sound of the current is not gone. It is merely quieter, tucked inside the bones, ready to be called forth by a shared story or a spilled cup of hot tea. I tell my grandchildren about that summer, not to boast of skill or luck, but to offer a piece of the map I carry, a reminder that some things we spend a lifetime learning are as simple and true as a bend in a river and a patient voice that says, wait. The days pass with a tenderness that almost hurts to name, and I have learned to be grateful for the small, ordinary gifts that survive time, a fisherman's patience, a grandfather's quiet faith, a river that becomes a memory you can return to as needed. The memory answers back when I am weak and when I am strong, when fear or regret tries to take hold. It reminds me to spare a little room for gentleness, for listening, for the slow art of simply being present with another living thing, be it a child or a fish or a day that asks nothing more than our steady breath. Time may pass, but the meaning remains, held in the quiet bend of the river, in my memory, and in the patient hands that taught me how to wait. And for that, I am grateful beyond words, for the day when hunger and haste yielded to listening, and a boy learned to fish not for the catch, but for the possibility of staying. The river keeps its old promises, and so do I.